House Majority Leader Jason Rojas, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.
So, your parents moved from Puerto Rico to find safer neighborhoods and better schools to essentially live the American dream, like so many people before and after you. They found East Hartford to be an affordable place to settle down. Now you're the House Majority Leader. You've focused work on making sure that places like where you grew up continue to be affordable across Connecticut. How does that work of affordability and realizing the American dream really start with getting housing right?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's one of those like basic needs, right? When you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Shelter is a very basic one. And I've begun to argue over the last year or our last couple of years, right, about how it's central to obviously the stability of families. And then from there, it's to stability of neighborhoods, right? And you keep going out in concentric circles, that contributes to the stability of communities and then the state. And it's a really basic function that allows families to be able to feel safe, to be able to provide for their children, for their kids to have a place to come home to that's stable, and gives them an opportunity to learn, right? Or have access to higher resource schools, or have access to relatively safer neighborhoods, or have access to neighborhoods that have less of a toxic environment, whether it's environmental or socially. And it's just really central to our lives. And, that my neighborhood that I grew up in, I think would often be viewed as low income and dangerous, and lots of other things, right? And my experience was like, no, right? There were some negative things that happened in a neighborhood like mine, but more than anything, it was a whole bunch of families who looked out for each other. I would say there was a lot of social capital in a neighborhood that was otherwise lacking in other forms of capital, right? Whether economic. And yeah, and it's really driven me. And then as I got older and I got into the kind of policy making business, I really began to understand the intersection of housing and education policy. And really wondering why was it that poverty was growing so significantly in my hometown? And it's higher now than it was when I was growing up. And how can it be that our school district is suddenly 90% children of color? And that got me kind of interested in questions of zoning, and how the government has acted over the last 100 years. And government at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, all levels complicit and actually designing what we have today, right? Which is actually pretty segregated society in terms of race and class, which I have argued is kind of at the core of our social dysfunction in many ways. And I work in higher education and I see it on our college campuses all the time. Colleges are the place that bring people from all walks of life together. And I find a lot of students struggle to relate to each other, particularly along lines of class and race, because they've actually never have a lived experience of living with people who are perhaps from a different cultural background, different racial background, and most definitely a different economic background. And I mean, colleges are great for figuring those things out, allowing young people to figure them out. But it's also not an easy thing for young people to do. And I find working in higher education, there's a lot of tension that arises on our campuses, not because people want to be racist or classist, but because they've never interacted with people from different walks of life. And these situations arise, which are unfortunate and terrible and lead to a lot of pain for people. But it's because we haven't given people the opportunity to actually have a shared lived experience.
Yeah, so outside of your work as House Majority Leader, your day job is at Trinity College as Chief of Staff to the President and Associate Vice President for External Relations.
Right.
And you bring up an important point about socialization in a cross-class, cross-race way. And college, for a lot of people, is kind of a rare time of that interesting socialization to happen. So working, at Trinity, being surrounded by college-age kids of a variety of different backgrounds, what perspective has that given you in terms of your drive to to create diverse housing solutions and keep young talent here in Connecticut, no matter what their background is?
Yeah, that's right. It's a real issue, right? I mean, I listened to a podcast, it was sometime in the last year, and there was an argument that was made in it that, housing is the primary way in which all of us engage with the economy. And part of it was doing polling around young people and how uncertain they feel about the future. And one of the primary drivers of that uncertainty is not knowing where they were going to live or whether they were going to be able to afford to live on their own and not live in their parents' basement, right? Or have some other kind of living situation that is not what they would prefer to have. And, it's part of recruitment and retention and economic vitality. We hear from our business leaders all the time. It's hard for them to recruit talent here. It's actually hard to retain talent here because of the cost of housing, generally the cost of living. And when we talk about the cost of living, I think most people think about taxes, which is fair. But I think we take for granted because it's an absolute necessity that the cost of housing actually contributes to the cost of living. And I think it has young people feeling really uncertain about, are they going to be able to achieve that American dream, right? And it doesn't necessarily, you don't go from not owning a house to owning a house in one full swoop, right? I mean, usually you end up renting an apartment somewhere, and you might rent an apartment for an extended period of time. But if you can't even afford that, it gives you a lot more uncertainty about being able to afford a home at some point.
Absolutely. I mean, as you know, as a young person myself, I'm 21. I talk to my friends, and they don't want to be, billionaires. They just want to have a sort of the life that their parents had access to, or,
Right.
just that middle class American life of just the breathing room, a vacation a year.
Yeah.
These are needs we absolutely share in common. Um,
Right.
I'm wondering, so from the time you grew up in East Hartford to today, now you're representing the area, does it look significantly different today in terms of its affordability in comparison to what it looked like then?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I mean, physically, it looks a lot of the same, right? It's a post-industrial blue-collar town built around Pratt Whitney, which is an aircraft engine maker. So it was, it was a manufacturing town, right, where a lot of the families of the past didn't necessarily go to college. Many did, but many were machinists, right? And it was a time where you could actually raise a family and own a home on one salary, and not necessarily have a college degree, right? You went and built airplane engines that powered the American military. It's a lot poorer today than it was when I was growing up. Poverty has raised significantly, and that's a dynamic we've seen with a lot of inner ring suburbs, right? As folks seeking opportunity from the urban core, looking for better neighborhoods, much like my parents did in the 1970s. They've moved to places like East Hartford because it does remain a relatively more affordable place than, say, the town to the north of us, South Windsor, or the town to the south of us, Glastonbury, which are great communities, very affluent. But you're talking about $700,000 homes. But even in a place like East Hartford with high poverty rates, I look at the real estate listings, and I see houses, ranches, right, in capes, like 1,200 square foot, 1,500 square foot, selling for $300,000, $350,000. Those are attainable today relative to the cost of other types of housing, but those used to be the starter homes that actually built the American dream for, a one salary family. I don't know that that's the case anymore, right? It's really hard to do so, and it's an older housing stock, which poses some opportunities and challenges for us. HGTV has really polluted everybody's minds around needing 5,000 square foot homes with 5 bathrooms. My first home was a 1,200 square foot ranch, had 3 bedrooms and 2 baths. It was perfect, man. It was really good for me, right? And I imagine it would be
Right.
perfect for a lot of families too. But it's also older, and a lot of people are looking for new and the granite countertops and all those types of things. So, I mean, people really need to think about what it is they think they need in a home as opposed to what they see on TV and are made to believe they think they need in a home.
It's an interesting note. I mean, it sounds like that is really that zoning and, the housing policy that we have in Connecticut is entrenching poverty in communities like East
100%.
Hartford.
Perpetuating
And
segregation as well. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So, so you were first elected then to the legislature in 2008. Can you give me some context on what the legislature had been working on in terms of housing reform prior to HB 8002, and whether, in your opinion, it was enough? Because now we have this, larger bill. There's a lot of eyes on housing, but this has been a crisis that's been simmering in the background, growing
Right.
for a while, and I'm sure you've seen that and been working on that for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because I haven't thought about that. If I think back to when I first started, housing was not really on the radar of very many legislators. I think it was something that we take for granted. I don't know what the percentage of legislators is that lives in single family homes, but I bet you it's pretty high. And so therefore, when that is your lived experience and that is your worldview, you're not really thinking about the need for multifamily housing. And zoning in Connecticut, I forget what the statistic is, but land in Connecticut is like 98% zoned for single family only, right? So a multifamily doesn't even exist in many communities. And if it does, it's on a much smaller scale, or it's limited to our urban core. So I think for most people, it wasn't something that anybody wanted to touch politically, because it is so politically challenging. I've taken, the opportunity to avail myself of really focusing on housing. And I started thinking about housing probably 12 years ago. I've been in the legislature. I mean, really diving into housing policy 12 years ago. I've always had an interest in it since joining the legislature. But, like most political things, once it became a problem for more people than just low income people, it became a more politically salient issue. I think we have a younger legislature, in terms of younger people and newer people who are hearing and seeing the challenges that housing affordability is posing for people in their districts. And I think they're willing to be more politically courageous about it, right? Because this isn't just legislators from the urban core advocating for changes around this. We're seeing a lot of our colleagues taking a brave step who represent suburban, affluent communities who are also saying we need to do something about housing affordability, because it's gotten to the point where, the empty nester couple who has a 5,000 square foot home wants their kids to move into the communities where they raise them, and their kids can't find housing, right? That's accessible, available, and affordable. So now it's starting to be like, wait, my grandkids can't live near me. And I think that's changing people's perspectives about having options. And for the individuals who want to move out of the 6,000 square foot home that they don't want to maintain anymore, they're realizing there's nothing for them to downsize to in the neighborhood in which they raised their family in. And I think that's changing people's perspectives too. Still a political uphill battle on a lot of these issues, but I often think the politics of it are noisier than they actually are. I think the opponents out there, the NIMBYs, are very good at creating a lot of noise, at scaring the hell out of people about what pro-homes folks like myself are actually trying to do. And we're starting to break through. And I think what we were able to do last year, and what's happening at the local level, is starting to show that there's actually a lot more political support for more housing growth and providing people access and choice around housing than people otherwise think.
It's an important point you bring up, this idea that housing has really become a centerpiece issue because it's begun to touch more people and people with more affluence. And I think it's an important reminder to make sure to take care of everyone, because it really is like what is happening to people in the less affluent areas of our society are eventually going to happen to us if we let the issue if we let it just fester.
That's
then
right.
It is going to grow.
Yeah.
And so,
even one of the areas where that's, where you hear a lot about it is we can't find housing for our teachers and our police and our fire. And that's fine. I want housing for police and fire and teachers too. I think using the examples of those individuals makes it more comfortable for people to make it acceptable. Once you start getting into lower income families, right, or even diversity in families of color, it gets a little bit more touchy. But whatever it takes for us to get the units built, I'm all for it. But that's where it really is becoming more salient for a lot of local leaders, is how do we get the people who work for our local governments to be able to live in our communities?
Yeah, I think what a lot of people are realizing as well is just that, like, when we talk about change, and I've talked about this with a few other people that I interviewed for this series, that our communities are changing. We don't have to institute some major reform. Sometimes the lack of reform is the change. Yeah. Like the fact that teachers can't afford to live in the communities that they live in, that was done. That is happening because we didn't change the law. Right. So I'd love you to just talk a little bit about that. We'll jump into HB 8002 in a second. But I just love this idea of change and how you conceive of how this lack of action can actually perpetuate a large problem.
Yeah, and the reality is every community's been changing ever since it was founded, right? I mean, that's, I know I'm oversimplifying it there, but that is the reality of things, right? No community stays the same. And I'm all for historic preservation, and I'm all for preserving farmland, and I don't want to pave over farms either, right? But there's a balance to all this, and I think for a long time, we have been at one far end of the spectrum on this question, and we just need to move to the middle a little bit to allow for different kinds of development and growth to take place.
Yeah, so to dive into HB 8002, there's so much, right? The Fair Rent Commission, parking reform, let's start at housing growth planning. What does it mean for municipalities across Connecticut to have access to these new funds for infrastructure if they're participating in one of the few options there are for to plan for housing growth?
Yeah, I mean, and that's what I told people. This is a really robust planning document. And I know that doesn't sound terribly sexy, but it's really important to getting housing built. You really got to have solid plans in place before you can achieve the actual. And that's the case for any goal you want to set. And we had a previous law in the books that called for towns to create affordable housing plans. When we originally passed that, we didn't put a lot of parameters about it. We didn't give any direction to what should be in the housing. The difference now with the housing growth plans is that they're going to be much more intentional, much more focused, and actually thinking about a diversity of housing options and not just simply affordable. We do need a lot more affordable housing, but we also just need more housing, period. Because at the macro level, right, obviously it's a supply and demand issue. The more supply we're able to build to meet the demand, the cost over the long run, right, will come down. And we're seeing that in a lot of places like in Texas, right? And I wouldn't necessarily argue for the Texas model where there's like no zoning whatsoever. There has to be some, but we're seeing you in most of the research, all the research you see it, when you build more, the rents come down for people, right? And that's a longer term, obviously, achievement that we'll eventually reach. But what we're calling for in the housing growth plans is, and to actually meet some of the needs of the communities, right? There's lots of concerns about that communities have about what housing is going to do to the look and feel of their community. And I get it, right? I'm not trying to make small town USA become a city. But every community, right, needs housing and needs a variety of housing and a diversity of housing. And what we're doing is trying to empower towns and forcing towns, quite frankly, to really be intentional about designing plans that make sense for the communities, but actually allow for growth.
So this is a more niche issue within HB 8002, but actually it kind of connects to the conversation we were having earlier around making sure that we're addressing issues that perhaps start in regards to lower level workers or people with lower incomes. And that's AI. On so many Americans' minds is how AI and algorithms and the ability for technological innovation to create new problems for normal people. This bill bans algorithmic rent setting. Can you tell me why that's important for tenants?
Yeah, I mean, well, it started off with our Attorney General actually filing a lawsuit against 6 large apartment providers who, were more or less appearing to collude around sharing rent information and using algorithms to set rents. And when it pulls in all that data and there's a recognition that you have apartments in, more affluent areas, like a place like Connecticut, and in particular down in Southwest Connecticut, where you're from, right? We found that they were setting rents using that kind of technology, and we just don't think they should be doing that, right? So the Attorney General filed a lawsuit against them, and we moved forward with passing legislation that would prevent those types of tools from being able to be used to be able to set rents, right? It is a anti-market type of thing that they were trying to do there, antitrust in some ways, and that's not something that we should allow. We don't allow it in many other areas of public policy and government, and it shouldn't have been allowed here either.
Absolutely. And one of the bigger parts that has garnered perhaps more of the controversy is parking reform in HB 8002. This bill prohibits the enforcement of parking requirements for residential developments of less than 16 homes. Or in other words, if in a lot of cases people don't want to have to pay for a parking space with their apartment, that they don't have to in more cases. Can you tell me sort of why that's important, especially as we're going into an era where affordability is just key for people?
Yeah, I mean, most of the information that we got from developers, it can cost anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 a parking spot to pay for that parking spot, right? And a lot of communities would use parking requirements as a way to stifle development, make it more difficult for developers to actually finance a project, to the point where, because of the parking requirements, people just don't propose developments at all, which has the effect of limiting the amount of housing that gets created in any given place. So what we did, instead of an outright ban, right, on parking requirements, we compromised and said, for 16-unit projects, right, that are going to be near transit, that are near a train station, on a bus line, let's give a little bit of flexibility to developer to to have fewer parking spots, recognizing that perhaps not everybody who makes a choice to live in that apartment building, right, is actually going to have a car. Therefore, they don't even need a parking spot. So when you were requiring 2 parking spots for every bedroom, right, and now you have 4 parking spots for a two-bedroom apartment, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? It might just be a young couple with a baby, right, and they have 1 car, or maybe they have 2 cars. And that was part of the thinking of looking at the issue of housing affordability. I think we take for granted all of the inputs and regulations, right? I now consider myself a supply side progressive, right? I did read Book Abundance, and I'm learning a lot from the book. But often as liberals, right, and progressives, we actually put a whole lot more regulations in place that work against the very goal that we're actually trying to achieve. And parking has just been one of those things. It's a cultural thing. We all want parking right outside the door of wherever we're going, whether it's our home, whether it's a restaurant, whether it's a retail store. We want parking everywhere. But that has a lot of ramifications for us that I don't think we appreciate. One, it wastes land. And in Connecticut, we don't have a lot of land available for development. So everything that we spend on parking lots comes at the expense of more units of housing or another retail development or even open space. 2, it creates more impervious surface so that we have more runoff going into our streams and our waterways. And we have to account for that. And then the last piece is what I always said, the cost, right? That is adding more cost per unit, which ends up getting passed on to you, the young renter, who's just trying to find an apartment to live in, who might live near a subway station or a bus stop and is okay with taking public transportation.
Yeah, I could speak for myself. I own an e-bike. That's how I get around. I take the e-bike, or I take the bus, or I take the train, and that's how I get around. And I think there's also a conservative way to frame this issue, which is, I'm sure if you were paying attention to politics 10, 15 years ago, you heard of the idea of an unfunded mandate.
Yeah,
that's what this is.
That's exactly what it is, right?
Yeah. So looking to the future, so I watched your speech at the HB 8002 signing press conference. It was quick, and quite frankly, you seemed anxious to do more. You wanted to celebrate, but you wanted to acknowledge that there is a lot more that we can do. What does that future work look like for you, whether it's ADUs or work on homelessness? What's coming down the pike this legislative session that people can look forward to? And also just longer term things that you're interested in working on.
Yeah, I told people one of the things that we often forget as lawmaking, we love to pass laws. Something that we don't focus as much on is actually implementation. And if you take any public policy class I did in graduate school, implementation is a really important part of lawmaking and the policymaking process. So at least for this legislative session, I haven't put more aggressive bills out there that seek to make changes around zoning. It's a difficult thing to do in Connecticut anyway, because of our preference for hyper local management of a lot of these decisions, which I agree to in part. So I'm really looking at implementation and trying to work on everything that we did in 8002, which was really multifaceted, making sure we get those things correctly. I still think we need to look at permitting reform. How do we speed up the process of developers being able to get into your local town hall and get through that costly, time demanding permitting process? Less popular with a lot of my friends in the environment community is looking at some of the environmental impediments to getting development done. I'm all for protecting the environment. I am pro-environment. But again, there are some things that are making it more difficult for us to actually make movement on this question. I think that's a future issue because it's a short session, and we'll come back to that in a longer session. I think right now there's a lot of folks looking at tenant protection issues. We do have this bill around just cause, which is not a housing development related issue, but obviously a housing issue. And how do we try to keep more people in their apartments as we see more institutional buyers coming in? And because of the value of housing and the huge run up that we've seen, there's a lot more institutional buyers, private equity coming in and buying homes. What happens is they come in and then displace people who have lived in their homes for their apartment/home for a very long time. They boot those people up, jack up the rents, which obviously makes it more unaffordable for people to be able to find an apartment building. So there are some folks here in Connecticut who want to add the just cause provisions, which essentially says you can't evict somebody unless you have a reason or a cause to do so. And we already have that in place for individuals with disabilities and for senior citizens. So the question is, do we expand that for everybody else?
So last question here, because I want to make sure I'm respecting your time. Yeah. We have an election this year, and the price of housing is looking like it's going to play a rather unprecedented role in shaping who wins, shaping particularly, as we talked about with young people, they're entering the job market. They're looking, a little further down the line. Some of our older Gen Z and younger millennials looking to buy a home. How are you looking to shape the conversation around housing and frame the issue, as one that needs to be addressed with the kind of reform we've talked about today? Because I love the what politicians are often great at is listing like the list of policies,
Right.
but then how does that turn into a narrative of we need housing reform? This needs to be acted on.
Yeah, and I think it is there. I think people are looking at their mortgage bills or looking at their rent, right? And recognizing that I'm paying a whole lot more housing. And there's many more elected officials actually talking about it. And I think that's important too in helping people understand how housing costs, which they just seem as a very basic need, so I'm going to take it for granted, right? I think people are recognizing that there are solutions that can help us address housing and provide people access to opportunity, and it has become a more politically salient issue, and that's why I think politicians are talking to the point where President Trump is even talking about it. I mean, I think he's kind of taken a gross kind of approach to it, actually, talking about single family homes as being like the sole solution to this and almost vilifying renters and apartment owners. And that's an argument, right? You're not allowing them to build wealth. I get it. I get it that the house is the primary creator of wealth for most American families. But you can't get back to the point I made at the beginning. You can't just leap into purchasing a home. You need to get established first and probably rent an apartment and build your career. And then when you're ready to settle down with a significant other and you want to buy a home, then you get to that point. But you need multifamily housing and apartments for people to first get established before they can go to that, achieve that final American dream.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Majority Leader Jason Rojas, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you, man. It was a great conversation, and I appreciate young people delving into this issue too, because you are the next renter or the next future homeowner, and you'd like to be able to do that someday, and it doesn't feel like you can right now. So,
absolutely, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, man.